Good morning and welcome to this session on the nature, scale and politics of fossil fuel production subsidies. A lot of the kind of impetus behind this panel session comes from Harry and I working on the book we promoted yesterday, so time for a bit more product placement. And we found out that I'm just gonna let people sit down. Harry and I realized that there's so much written about consumption subsidies, but less so on fossil fuel production subsidies. And most of the successful reforms have also been reforms of consumption subsidies. So we thought that the idea of production subsidies, fossil fuel production subsidies, and the reform of these subsidies would be nice to address in the context of this conference. I should highlight that there are 2 chapters in our book. Again, shameless product placement about production subsidies. One of them written by Gençsü and co-authors, and she's going to talk more about production subsidies in South Africa. But turning to production subsidies more generally, it is, I think, undisputedly something with a significant mitigation potential. One estimate from the Global Subsidies Initiative finds that phasing out fossil fuel production subsidies would reduce. Welcome. I repeat, one estimate from the Global Subsidies Initiative finds that phasing out production subsidies would reduce emissions in the period 2017 to 2050 by 37 gigatons, corresponding to the annual emissions from the aviation sector. So there's a clear overlap between fossil fuel production subsidies and climate policy. And we're also going to touch upon this. The format for today is that each one of our brilliant panelists are going to do a brief presentation, about 5 minutes. And then we are going to talk, then I'm going to ask one, perhaps 2 questions about fossil fuel production subsidies in general. We're going to have a brief round on this basis. And then we're going to open up for questions from the audience. It'd be nice if you can come up with some relatively general questions that could be directed to perhaps the entire panel, perhaps a couple of the panelists. Well, let's briefly put the structure for this panel. We have some excellent people here from Burton from the University of Cape Town, and Fougner Helseth from the Bellona Foundation, Ipek Gençsü from the ODI, Steenblik from the OECD. And I think I should just start off by giving the floor to you, Gençsü. Gençsü is, I should say a few words in more detail about Gençsü, is a researcher at the Energy Research Center at the University of Cape Town. She teaches and does research on energy and climate change policy, particularly South African coal and electricity subsidies and sectors in general.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Now can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Hi. So first of all, I have to just say that my co-authors did a lot of the quantitative analysis of this chapter, so please don't ask me questions about things like what was your assumption about the bond rate, for example, because I won't remember. But I hope to talk a little bit more about rather what we did and why. And I'll talk you through the scale, kind of how much larger the production subsidies were than we'd expected, but also when we spoke to people in government and civil society, kind of the stories that they tell themselves about where these subsidies come from. So what did we do? First of all, we looked a little bit at kind of how had this coal intensity that South Africa has, where did it come from? I mean, we're one of the most coal-intensive countries in the world. About 75% of our primary energy comes from coal. We're very much an outlier. And there's sort of this idea that because we had coal and it was cheap, that's where it came from. It was natural. But if you go back and you start to look at where our huge coal-fired power plant fleet came from and our coal-to-liquids plants and our reliance on coal for other things, actually it was all created by the states. And none of those, what were actually subsidies, are ever called subsidies. So we went back in time a little bit and we couldn't quantify them all, but we were interested to say, look, Eskom had prescribed asset rules that lowered its cost of capital and allowed it to build these large capital-intensive power plants. Sasol, the coal-to-liquids manufacturer in South Africa, they were a state-owned company built by the government, guaranteed prices, import parity prices for their coal-to-liquids fuel. Lots of money moved around between them and other oil companies to protect Sasol's place in the market over time. And when they were privatized, they were kind of guaranteed that the regulatory framework wouldn't change. And if it did, they wouldn't have to pay back any loans that they had borrowed from the government. So those kinds of things made coal very, very competitive in South Africa. And no one really understands that that's what's created the differential between coal and alternatives that still persists up until about 3 years ago. So we looked at that a little bit and kind of tried to trace who had benefited from it. And of course, primarily it was other big corporate interests indirectly because they had underpriced electricity, and electricity, for example, was underpriced because of all these other kinds of subsidies that existed. And then we said, what exists now? And of course, there was work by the OECD, and there was lots of work by IISD, but it looked only at a few years. So we wanted to kind of expand that and look at the last 10 years, say where did these subsidies come from? What's really interesting is that, of course, the direct subsidies on the supply side are relatively limited. There's not that much money going straight into coal mining, for example, except as part of the more general mining regime. But all the money kind of is channeled through the users. So it was channeled through the state-owned railways, the state-owned steel makers, Eskom and Sasol. Of course, steel and railways are no longer state-owned, but still Sasol and Eskom, who are the two largest users of coal in South Africa, they're subsidized, and the subsidies flow into coal mining. So it's indirect for the most part. We can fight about whether that counts as a subsidy in that case, but we thought it did. So you end up with 10 or 12 of these giant mines all over the country based on this historical development of coal. Then we looked at over the period 2007 to 2015, kind of where did all these subsidies come from, and that direct transfers is much bigger than it is in other. By other people who've done this analysis, because we include, for example, a big government loan to Eskom that was later converted to equity, and all of the interest that Eskom never paid the government for the loan. And we take that as a subsidy to fossil fuels because they say explicitly this is for capital investment into Medupi and Kusile, our two big coal-fired power plants that are under construction, and 3 other coal stations that they were returning to service. These are in 2016 US dollars. So in rands, it's a little bit different, and the rand is very volatile, so it's a bit smaller now in US dollars, but that's fine. A lot of government revenue foregone, and that comes from tax breaks and various other mechanisms. I won't go through all the detail, except also to mention Sasol's market price support. Unfortunately, like with all subsidies research everywhere, it's very hard to kind of work out. You don't have the data that you need to see where the subsidy is flowing from. But in this case, a regulated fuel price guarantees them a whole lot of rent, which they take as rent. And only in 1 year did we have the data to actually calculate it. And you can see it's about R1 billion, 127 million US dollars. And the next part of our analysis was to kind of say, what is the story behind these subsidies? Because they're not called subsidies in South Africa. No one ever mentions the word subsidies when they talk about production at all. Consumption subsidies, yes, for electricity, but that's it. And when you talk to and you look at the government documents behind all of these transfers, they're always about economic development and the ideas that the state has about economic development. So for Eskom, of course, energy security, but it's also a lot of it for infrastructure development, so for water to support coal mining or coal-fired power plants, pipelines, and it's all going into sectors that the government thinks of as key to its industrial development pathway, and the way that it is going to involve the state, which the state calls itself developmental, in those processes. So it's kind of a part of this much broader story about economic development and development pathways. Now I'm out of time. Sorry. I had so much more to say.
I know you do, but thank you for
always
for a very, very interesting presentation, which also kind of speaks to the difficulties of identifying and studying and gathering data about fossil fuel production subsidies. So it's a very impressive undertaking you have carried out there. Next on the program is Anne Fougner Helseth from the Bellona Foundation. Anne is an environmental law advisor at the Bellona Foundation, working on fossil fuel production subsidies, inter alia addressing through litigation, and also including petroleum taxation. Is one of your, I think, specialities, I understand, or fighting it perhaps, or not fighting it, but working on petroleum taxation. So, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I'll be discussing production subsidies in the case of Norway. Now, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a backdrop when we discuss this. This number is the current value, or the value some weeks ago. It's developed a little bit now of the Norwegian, what we call the oil fund. So the pension fund global is the correct name, but it's the fund built on our oil wealth basically, and its current value is 890 billion euros. So to give you a little bit of perspective, we're not that many people in Norway, so that's about 170,000 euros per inhabitant. So that's the reason why when we use this word support or even subsidies in connection with the petroleum industry in Norway, it's quite controversial, especially with the industry. And the whole oil wealth of Norway has been channeled into the welfare state by or through the petroleum tax system of Norway. And it's true that if you make money on Norwegian continental shelf, you pay 78% taxes, so quite heavy. But because of that, there are also some schemes in place to sort of help to begin with. And there are a lot of them, but I'm going to be focusing on one that has to do with exploration. So if you're a company looking for oil on the Norwegian continental shelf, you can deduct 78% of all your direct and indirect exploration costs from your tax base. But in 2005, the government found out that that doesn't really help the companies that do not pay taxes because they're new on the shelf or they don't earn enough money. So then we'll just try and sideline those companies by handing out the equivalent amount cash on their account as reimbursement. So 12 billion euros has been paid out since then. And this money are paid out without any guarantees that the state will ever be able to recoup the amounts through tax, because they don't know if the companies will actually ever pay taxes. So obviously a very golden scheme, and in Bellona we also believe it's illegal under EU EEA rules. So Norway is obliged to follow basic EU rules through the EEA agreement, including regarding state aid. And so we complained to the authority that's set to make sure that this is actually followed. We complained about this scheme last summer. So they're looking into whether or not they should open a formal investigation. And they usually try to solve cases within a year, so we're now on overtime. And we've seen pretty heavy correspondence between both this authority and Norwegian authorities, and also between ministers in Norway and the Attorney General. And the letters in the case are just increasing in length, so it seems like the state does not regard itself off the hook yet. And according to commentators, the fact that this case is still going on means it's, or for every week that goes by, it's a stronger case. Also, according to commentators, this risk is already priced in the boardrooms, or regarded in the boardrooms. And the big deal here is that if the money, or if the support is regarded illegal state aid, the legal part has to be paid back from the companies to the state. So given that it's 12 billion euros, that could be quite dramatic implications. So we've also seen quite a lot of industry getting involved. And it's of course impossible to say how this turns out, but we feel that regardless of the outcome, this case, along with other efforts by other NGOs, has contributed to shifting the debate a little bit, at least, because it used to be the case that we would say, hey, there's actually some support and maybe even subsidies for the petroleum industry, and the industry would say, are you crazy? We pay 78% taxes. We built this fund, how can you say such a thing? And now we've come to a point where we can sort of maybe both realize that both parties see the whole picture, and we still want to discuss. the subsidies questions. And also for the public debate has shifted a little bit the last years, I think. People are getting a little bit more aware of this whole scheme and the risks connected to it. But of course, it's very technical, so it's not like a huge popular movement as of now. Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how the case evolves. And there's definitely still a long way to go in Norway when talking about production subsidies. So I'm very happy also to be here to learn more about efforts worldwide today. Yeah, I forgot to switch this one, but it's been addressed in several press stories as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for a very interesting presentation. It's nice to have covered both an emerging economy and industrialized country now that is quite well known as being widely considered a green leader internationally,
Yeah.
but also the problems that you have in Norway with fossil fuel production subsidies and kind of the legal and political battles that surround these subsidies. So it's very enlightening. So from two country case discussions, we're moving on to a brief presentation about the level of fossil fuel production subsidies and the nature of them in Europe in general, and to Ipek Gençsü, who is a senior research officer at the Overseas Development Institute and has done research on a wide range of topics. I cannot cover all of them. I cannot do you justice here, so you have to look it up. But it also includes stuff like the new climate economy and the Global Commission on Economy and Climate Change. So here you go, Ipek.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this session. We hope to move on to a really interesting debate after our presentations, and we look forward to your participation as well. I'd like to tell you a bit about the research we did at ODI and also with colleagues at Climate Action Network Europe on subsidies to fossil fuel production in Europe. So just quickly to talk to you a bit about the rationale for this research. EU countries have committed to phasing out environmentally harmful subsidies, including those to fossil fuels by 2020. They've made commitments at various international fora as part of the G7, as part of the G20. And of course, Paris Agreement commits all countries to making finance flows consistent with a 2-degree pathway and a zero net emissions by the second half of the century. But unfortunately, currently, there's no tracking process and no obligation for countries to disclose this information, and there's no accountability to meet their promises. So really our research at ODI and also with colleagues at IASD and other partners have been to highlight the amount of subsidies that are being provided by governments and other form of government support in Europe. And we've also done work in other countries. So this particular research looks at 11 European countries. We didn't have the capacity to look at all of them, but they make up 83% of Europe's emissions. And also we looked at the EU budget and various mechanisms through which the EU provides support as well. So our main findings, before I get to the numbers, which is what sometimes people are most interested in, but actually our more important findings are really about the limited transparency in most countries. So through inventories such as the OECD, but also government documents, we're able to gather some of the fiscal support measures that are being provided. But there are lots of gaps, and especially in countries like Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Greece, we really had a lot of trouble trying to identify the amount of tax breaks and budgetary support going to production of fossil fuels. Similarly, we look at investment going from public finance institutions, public finance being provided by these institutions, and also investments of state-owned enterprises, because we see them as an important part of government support. And again, these are often the institutions whose information is very difficult to find. So we looked at various sources through their annual reports, through other reliable public reporting on various project cases. But again, we don't believe that we've got a complete picture. But what we have found is that there is, between the years of 2014 and 16, on average per year, about over 13.5 billion euros of fiscal support being provided to fossil fuel production, about almost 12 billion euros of public finance. This is both domestically and within the EU, but also obviously being provided to countries in many parts of the world. And again, about 11.4 billion euros of SOE investment. So this totals to about 34.5 billion euros per year on average. And as I mentioned, these figures are from 2014 to 16 average. Of course, we can be updating these numbers as new information is released. And of course, the investment in these various sectors hopefully decline over the years. But that's something for us to do in the coming years. But just to go into specific findings per sector and what I mean by fossil fuel production subsidies, we specifically looked at coal mining, and we did see some decrease in support to mining in line with EU directives, but there's still significant amount of support going to transition away from coal, and this raises questions about whose responsibility it is to support this transition to workers and rehabilitation of coal mining sites. We think perhaps there's a discussion to be had about how much responsibility the companies should have. And of course, SOEs continue to invest in coal, but again, information was very limited. There's the highest amount of subsidies we've identified were for oil and gas production. Again, there's a lot of detail that we could go into later on, but one main finding was that the subsidies for gas production coming from the Europe's budget especially were taking into account overestimations of demand for gas. And this is particularly concerning as it's locking us in to more gas pipelines. And finally, electricity production. So we looked at just the fossil fuel based portion of electricity production. This was getting the second highest amount of subsidies provided in these three areas. And this was mainly through fiscal support and again, SOE investment. But as I said, it's more about asking the questions about transparency and information and holding governments accountable to providing this, because unlike consumption subsidies, perhaps we do need a bit more information. Sorry, I should stop there. I've reached the end of my time, but we'll continue the discussion later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I think it's also goes back to the issue of transparency that Gençsü also talked about, and also you also highlighted the kind of distinction between, on the one hand, oil and gas and the political economy of oil and gas versus the political economy of coal. But you also brought in electricity, because this distinction between oil and gas and on the one hand and coal is something I've taken with me from this conference in general. There seems to be a pretty different political economy of these different kind of fossil fuels. But going back to transparency, I think one institution that has, besides the ODI and the GSI and Oil Change International, has done a lot historically to, and also currently, to increase transparency has been the OECD. And I think Ron has been a key driver and the most active person in promoting fossil fuel subsidies and addressing fossil fuel subsidies within the OECD, and Ron has a long track record within the OECD. So I think you're well placed to kind of be the last person to wrap up and talk a bit more generally about the nature, scale and politics of fossil fuel production subsidies.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. My presentation is structured around the questions that Jakob asked the speakers, so it's a little bit different from the others. My first point is that because oftentimes we do hear about, well, why are production subsidies ignored? They're not really, but I'll speak in a moment about why I think consumption subsidies have gotten more attention. People have been looking at and criticizing subsidies to fossil fuels for many years. Any of you know Doug Koplow know that he's a researcher in the United States, has been highly critical of production subsidies in that country for a long time. My first job when I came to the International Energy Agency, a sister agency of the OECD, back in 1987, was to compile estimates of subsidies to coal production, mainly in Europe and also Japan, and that was published in 1988. And that series was updated for about another 10 years. When the OECD took on trying to develop an inventory for the subsidies provided by OECD countries, we made sure that fossil fuel production subsidies were included from the beginning. We were the only intergovernmental organization that did, and not only at the national level, but also at the subnational level. That work was started in 2010, first published in 2011. Why have consumption subsidies received more attention? Well, for one, the most common kinds, those provided through price controls or export restrictions, are easier to measure compared with those for fossil fuel production, which, as we've heard from Ipek and others, involves really digging into the books, and oftentimes these are more obscure, especially if they're provided to or through state-owned enterprises. And we found out also, or I did anyway, back in the 90s when the World Bank got big into this, that they didn't really understand the connection that subsidies to fossil fuels, particularly those which kept up the price, which was the case in Europe, could actually have a detrimental effect on emissions. That's a whole other topic, though. But of course, I mean, maybe the biggest reason is that consumption subsidies aggregate to levels that are much larger, possibly an order of magnitude larger, although we have to give a caveat on that in that those have been measured for more countries than the production subsidies have. And that tends to grab more headlines. And then, I mean, then the latest example, of course, are the IMF numbers, which count something completely differently, and those are in the trillions compared with in the tens of billions or maybe 100 billion for production subsidies. It's also from a political economy perspective, it's usually the case that fossil fuel producers are much more concentrated and therefore able to coordinate their lobbying efforts than our consumers. In most countries, fossil fuel producers are either single state-owned entities or, as in most OECD countries, they're dominated by large multinationals. According to the Fortune Global 500's list of the world's largest companies by consolidated revenue, in 2018, 5 of the top 10, Sinopec, China National Petroleum, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, and ExxonMobil, were state-owned or multinational integrated oil and gas companies. So, you know, they're big. But also governments may have many reasons they use to justify supporting fossil fuel production, energy self-sufficiency, regional employment, especially in the case of coal and peat, and the income tax revenues that they're generated. So we heard that earlier in the previous presentation about India. And they may even reckon that foregoing tax revenue on primary oil or gas production in one area may still be worth it if the value added to the economy, the whole economy, from exploiting domestic resources compensates for those tax expenditure losses. Have we counted all forms of support to production? No. I mean, notably, we still have to estimate the subsidy or grant equivalent of credit subsidies and the kind of state-owned enterprise investments that may be benefiting from concessional finance. So to that end, earlier this year, we published a paper in our companion report which sets out a proposed procedure for doing that. So that, hopefully we can get to that and draw on some of these estimates of the principal values of loans and loan guarantees that the NGOs like ODI and OCI have produced. I've been asked to conclude, so just to say that there are nonetheless and this may come as a surprise, we think that there are legitimate issues that are raised by particularly oil and gas producers as to what of the kinds of tax expenditures that we're measuring really are subsidies. I mean, a classic case came up in Mexico. If a country has made it clear what their tax position is, and they basically seek bids for access to the resources on how much royalties or whatever taxes the company is going to pay, in theory, that's the way to capture all the rent. And there's lots of caveats on that. And then finally, is there a bright spot? Well, Ipek's already mentioned it. Coal, we've seen the closure a couple of years ago, the last underground coal mine in the UK. We'll see it in Germany this year. And Norway basically has cut back, decided to close all but a small amount of coal production in its Spitsbergen mines. So thank you.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists for some very interesting presentations, which are more meant to be kind of appetizers for the larger debate. So, as mentioned, I sent out some questions before. I'd like to pose the first one of them to the panel. I don't know if you'd like to go first, Jesse. So the question is, why are production subsidies so difficult to reform compared to the cases we've seen of successful reform of consumption subsidies in the last 10 years? So would you want to say something on the basis of your research and your work?
Sure. So I can only comment on South Africa. I mean, the first thing, of course, is that none of them are defined as subsidies, so nobody believes that they exist. There's no public discussion about it whatsoever. Where the government understands that they're supporting infrastructure investment or other things, they call it vital or strategic investments. So again, it's not a fossil fuel subsidy. It's something to help development or economic development of a particular region. So you see this, they support, for example, water infrastructure to support coal mining or pipelines or whatever it is. And they want to support heavy industry because in the ANC, that's what the state does. We have historically been a very interventionist state, and the state should intervene in economic development, and it does that by investing in infrastructure. So they're not subsidies, they're economic development policies.
But a rose by another name is...
Yeah.
Yes, but that's a very interesting answer to the question.
Yeah. So I'll come in from the Norwegian perspective then. And as mentioned, it's the main support schemes are through this tax system, and it's quite opaque. It's not very easy to address as like a civil society, and also the companies, they know everything about this, whereas the civil society knows close to nothing. So it's of course hard to mobilize. In the work with this complaint, we've been talking about to several professors in different relevant fields who will say, you know, this is something that only an industry lawyer can tell you, because the details are so detailed. So it's really hard to keep track of everything and understand exactly how it works, and therefore it's also hard to pinpoint and mobilize it around.
So that's great with some kind of first-hand, frontline experience from the fight against fossil fuel subsidies.
But it really is quite almost surprising almost how hard it is to sort of grasp the whole thing and understand exactly how it works and what the problems are.
Yeah, it sounds very, very complex.
Well, I think we're going to sound like a broken record as a panel and just keep talking about how untransparent things are. But yeah, I mean, again, in our research, same things came up. And as you say, if it takes a lawyer to really understand what's going on, how do you communicate to this to the public? And I guess the difference between consumption and production subsidies has been that consumption subsidies concern consumers, and it's much more part of their daily lives, and they're much more well known, I guess. So one lesson to draw from this is perhaps there's much more role for the civil society organizations and for us researchers to work with them to continue to bring this information out into the public, and for them to then communicate to voters who can then put the pressure on governments, because as Jesse said, governments deny, the UK still denies that it provides any fossil fuel subsidies, and using rhetoric and wording, they try to sort of hide the fact that this goes on at the scale that it does, especially. So a lot of work for us to do, I think, to keep digging and bringing it to the public.
Great. So that's interesting to hear, like the confirming some of the statements made before, but also adding to new comparisons to the consumption subsidies, how they're different, how that might make consumption subsidies actually easier to reform, although it actually provides tangible benefits to all citizens. So, Ron, do you want to have another word on this?
Yeah, just very briefly.
Yeah.
There was a presentation yesterday which talked about the historical legacy of support to oil, and I think that there's two aspects to that. One is once these patterns of treatment of tax policies and so forth was established, they tend to be to get locked in place. And the second is that since it's a multinational industry, that then people who are advising countries or the industry itself then expects to see those repeated elsewhere. So if it becomes the international norm that you have certain kinds of policies, then it makes it harder to argue that's actually providing support. The second thing is just in terms of communication, that we've tried to work with modelers about using some of our information on the supply side, and the models out there that can really do this well are not so many. Whereas if you have something that just simply reduces the consumption price, that's relatively straightforward to model. So getting the information on the effects of the reforms is more difficult.
Well, thank you for another interesting answer to the question. I think it's time. We have about half an hour left, because I understand we should be on time for lunch. So we have about half an hour left for questions. It'd be great if you could try to have, at the beginning, the more generic questions to the entire panel. I think Iveta, you were the first one. Maybe we should collect 3 questions now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the interesting presentations, and thank you for referencing GSI work. We are very happy to have worked on the subject. So my question is to all of you, in your respective context, how useful you found the term subsidies, because it obviously works for countries with predominantly private sector, which is kind of saying that subsidies are bad, more or less. But in countries like South Africa, subsidy will be just placing money from one government pocket into the other. And I know that OECD is using the term government support and not subsidies. So, like, in terms of language, what do you think is most useful?
Should we pass it on to, I think, Neil or the lady in the front?
Thank you. My name is Taryn Fenn. I'm from Norway. I have just one comment that I wish to have your considerations on, Anna. As I understood, you had this. You were worried about this cash handout, and I have another interpretation of how the system works. So, and actually, I'm not alone. We had a paper some months ago, 10 economists, that discussed a little bit about the system, and what it and one important point here is that all the tax deduction is very generous for all oil companies, and when you're in a tax position, you will get that as a very high advantage. But if you don't are in a tax position, you will not get that advantage, and that is why the system is supplemented with the handouts. So it's not actually the handouts that are the inefficiency problem from an economic point of view. It is the deductions that you can do on capital depreciation.
Should we pick a third question?
Hi, I'm Neil McCullough from the Policy Practice. I had one question for Jessie and one question for Anna. Jesse, you've described the South African situation beautifully, but there are lots of other countries, particularly in Africa, that believe in state-driven industrialization with cheap electricity for industry and manufacturing to generate jobs. Think of Ethiopia, think of Tanzania, think of Nigeria and so forth. Are they all wrong? And if they're not, what lessons would you suggest that they should learn from South Africa? Because many of them look to South Africa as a model to follow, rather than as having gone horribly wrong, bearing in mind that South Africa is significantly wealthier per person than they are. And then the question for Anna, you described very nicely the challenge of how one gets across the idea of significant subsidies when an industry is also extremely heavily taxed. How do we communicate the concept of fossil fuels being heavily subsidized in industries which are taxed more heavily than any other industry in the country?
Great. Who would like to go first? Do you start in reverse order with Ron? Or do you want to have...
Oh, I mean, these were directed, I thought, to...
Yeah.
Okay, I can go. Thanks, Aveta. I kind of oscillate between support and subsidies because the word subsidies is so powerful. But I'm always nervous, like, oh, is it really a subsidy? Is it support? All the definitions. Some of the civil society organizations use both as well, kind of as a sort of narrative of depending how they're using it and what they're saying. The other thing we found really useful is to call subsidies negative carbon prices and then link them to the carbon tax. So we've got a carbon tax, hasn't been implemented yet, but for electricity we're really low. It'll be about 48 Rand a tonne. But there are 2 new coal IPPs that are going to have support through basically a guaranteed price for their electricity for 20, 30 years, which is much higher than the alternatives. And we know what they're going to emit because we know how they're going to be run, and we know that the negative carbon price that it works out at is about double that. And using that like made people really sit up. I hadn't expected it actually, but they were like, wow, why are we having a carbon tax and supporting these coal plants? Like, that's crazy. So I think it just kind of depends on what you're trying to do and also who you're talking to. If that answers your question.
Should we answer all questions at once, or?
You can pick 2 if you want to. Yeah.
Okay, so I can continue on that line first,
Yeah.
or if you don't.
Yeah, okay.
So for Norway's case, the term subsidies, I put support there instead of subsidies for a reason. It's also that it's a term that you're sort of nervous about using, and it really causes it maybe puts the focus where it shouldn't be, because it places the whole conversation in this, we pay a lot of taxes, back and forth ping pong thing that doesn't get you anywhere, where if you use terms that are slightly less controversial, it's maybe easier to get further in the conversation. And to Taryn's comment, yes, there was a lot of things in the petroleum scheme that I didn't have time to point out. There are some schemes that are in one way more generous. For instance, if you find oil and you start building a Norwegian petroleum field, the state covers about 88% of your investments, or takes the risk for about 88%. So you can lose, if you invest 100 million euros, you can maximum lose 12, and the state can lose 88. But that's deduction. So immediately it seems a little bit more okay, but then you of course also have, this gets a little bit technical, but you have the possibility to transfer your tax losses with interest and then to get them reimbursed when you close down. So yes, there are it's a lot of schemes that are pretty much as golden. One thing with the tax reimbursement scheme is that it can be pledged. The tax what's it called, skattekrav, the tax, yeah. The right you have to get this money can be pledged, and that's not true for other tax rights. Or I don't remember the correct term. So that's a practical implication that we think puts this in a little bit of another category than the other. But and also it's just a concept of like cash money that's so in your face, sort of absurd. So it's maybe easier to pinpoint So that's why we targeted this exactly that. We also asked this authority to look at the whole petroleum system. Yeah, I don't take that much more.
Yeah, no, it's more, Ron, you raised your finger. Was it direct comeback or was it?
Just I realized that there was one question that I should have responded to, which was why do we use the term government support? Is really historical reasons. The original work in the part of the OECD that we work in was on agriculture, and they used government support because it was tied to the WTO negotiations, and the WTO language on subsidies does not include the value to producers of border protection, so quotas or import tariffs. And so government support was a slightly broader term. It was also being used by the Australian Industry Commission. And so it's really more of a legal term, so that the people don't say, wait a minute, that's not the WTO definition. It's WTO definition plus. Now, when we work for in chairing the G20 peer reviews, they use the term subsidies, so we use that term in our reports. But it's that slight distinction that and the indicators we use are also called producer support estimate and consumer support estimate. So,
I mean, just a final word on this. I agree with Jesse that it kind of depends on the circumstances, and we need to, I think as researchers we get too bogged down in this debate, and we have to again think about the communications of our work and the impact of our work in countries. So when we work with our NGO partners, so for this European report and work, the communications of which we were doing it with a number of countries, we kind of took their word for what would be most impactful given the current circumstances and the political debate at the time. So while it's important to amongst ourselves be aligned in what constitutes subsidy versus support, I think in communicating we have to be more open-minded.
Yes. Should we do another round of take 3 questions now?
I've got one.
Sorry,
I have to answer. I'm sorry, but it's such a good question. That's why I'm insisting. Thank you for such a good question. So the South African state, I mean the apartheid state as well, I mean their history of intervention is exceptional. They were really good at making industry happen. It was just only benefited a very small portion of the population. I would never suggest that other countries shouldn't choose their own development pathways, but a few comments about the South African lessons maybe for those other countries. One, you lock in capital intensity, not labor intensity. And so we've got a very capital intensive economy with very little labor absorbing growth. So we actually don't have the structure of the economy that matches the people in the country, and we don't have a way of getting them into work. And that's a really big problem. So we're wealthy on average, but we're very unequal in general as well. So it continues only to accrue to the holders of capital and not to workers or anybody else. The other point is that I think this kind of resource-based industrialization can only take you so far. It's taken South Africa further because they, in the 90s, liberalized really rapidly and destroyed all of the other kinds of industry that we had. So we actually deindustrialized, but we had subsidized electricity. So some of these big capital-intensive sectors remain dominant, but it doesn't employ a lot of people. And we're at a point now where you need much more sophisticated kinds of industrial policy. But I think the government and the ANC they don't know how to do that. Partly it's state capability, and partly they don't understand what's needed to understand value chains and where we fit into that in the rest of the world. And that's also about politics. You need a particular kind of relationship between government and business, and instead we're going the opposite way. Like it's all falling apart instead of saying like how do we make a much better kind of industrial policy for the country. And I will just say, I don't think our development pathway was that good, so I wouldn't follow it. But countries have to decide that themselves, I think.
Great. Let's take 3 more questions now, because I see a lot of hands.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mathieu Blondel, Ghent University. I was wondering, or I'm under the impression that there are different interpretations of how to operationalize fossil fuel producer subsidies or fossil fuel subsidies in general. And not just from a perspective of the industry, but also among organizations and NGOs and research institutions that do research on subsidies. And I'm wondering how these different operationalizations and definitions of subsidies affect, or to what extent does this affect bringing across the message of having to reform and phase out subsidies in light of climate change? How does this affect bringing across the message to government officials and regulators, etc.? Thank you.
Hi, thanks. I'm Richard Heaney with Climate Accountability Institute. And in a previous life with the Rocky Mountain Institute, I surveyed and quantified US federal subsidies to the energy sector, mostly to energy supply, some to renewables, of course, and a minor amount to energy efficiency. And I think this question is for Ron. Certainly consumption subsidies will increase demand. But in my thinking back then in the 80s, the fossil fuel production subsidies were much more important in terms of steering capital into bad buys, additional capacity. And I'm wondering if that thinking still holds, that fossil fuel capacity expansion is much more important than the consumption side of subsidies.
Gregory Gençsü from Tolka University. So I've got a question that might come across as a bit naive. I don't care if you think that's the case, but I'm just a bit of a fan of litigation, let's say. So I'm just wondering if this pledge that's non-legally binding of the G7 governments to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, if that's not followed through by 2020, is there a way that the NGO sectors or the citizens could make governments accountable for this through litigation? Is that talked about at all in your circles? Thanks.
Thank you for some great questions. Should we do it in the reverse order this time? Yeah. Sure.
Which is the reverse order? Yes. So, to answer also in reverse order, well, sort of Neil's question about the effects of production subsidies. I think basically on overall use and the structure of the energy economy. I would tend to agree. I mean, just 8 years ago we had a workshop on, and a large focus of that was on production subsidies, and we started asking government representatives what was in their calculus when they were deciding on the setting of their taxation policy and so forth. Was it to maximize rents? Was it to maximize the income of the industry? Was it to maximize the effect in the overall economy? And we got very mixed answers on that. But basically, it was interesting to see that even some of the countries that were very taking internationally a very public stance on fighting climate change, their attitude about their resources was not, let's keep it in the ground. It's like, we got to get this stuff out of the ground as soon as we can. So I think that the policies towards particularly oil and gas development have been just part and parcel of this whole idea of somehow we have to keep developing this. On coal, it's much more, I think, related to labor and regional issues and so forth, wherever you go. And certainly I think people have said that in aggregate, if you're supporting the industry, then that's going to reduce the international price. There's debate over, for example, in 20 years ago, the extent to which Europe was subsidizing coal industry, what effect that was having on the price. But it was affecting decisions in other ways. And one of the things that I mentioned before, economists not appreciating this, we had a World Bank economist come in, and when they were doing their first study, and I was saying, well, are you also going to look at some of these production subsidies in Europe? Oh, no, those are keeping the domestic price high for so that discourages consumption. What they didn't realize was the only way that the governments were keeping the domestic price for their coal producers high was through domestic purchase obligations. So basically, the policies were whatever our domestic producers produce, you electric utilities have to consume it. And one of the effects of that was to keep in operation coal-fired power plants that any other country would have been retired a long time ago, because they just had to have some place to push this coal through and burn. They weren't cared about the efficiency of those coal plants. So, I mean, definitely, I think that once you work out the more subtle effects, you definitely get an effect on overall use from production subsidies.
Right, so I think on the legally binding question, yes, you're right that these commitments are not legally binding, and I'm not an expert, but there have been cases where NGOs have been suing their governments. For example, in the Netherlands, I think there was a case recently that the government is not doing enough to meet their targets. But that is obviously one avenue. But without the legal aspect, I think we should hold governments accountable to their promises, and especially ones that they keep repeating over and over again. So again, it's perhaps not our role as researchers, but maybe working with NGOs, we need to keep reminding them and raising it in the public agenda. Just to confirm the question on, was it from Mathieu on operationalizing fossil fuel subsidy? Were you asking about the definitions that we use?
For example, the IMF with their
Yes.
How helpful is it?
Yeah, well, I guess some of us researchers in this room probably wouldn't say it's very helpful, because, I mean, it does present a very large number, basically taking into account some of the externalities of these subsidies as well. But in terms of reforming these subsidies, we think that the inventory method, which is looking at measure by measure, project by project, investment by investment, is probably the most practical way of going about it, because then that gives you opportunity for reforming these and to follow on in the conversation. But there are alternative methods. We shouldn't, we don't disagree with them. We should continue debating and looking at the problem from different angles, but we think it's most practical to go about it in this way.
Yeah, that sounds sounds smart. For us, I guess the whole definition question, it definitely has a lot to say, especially with this legally binding question, because what will probably happen is a lot will say, you know, we're not in trouble because we don't have fossil fuel subsidies, and that's a definition question. But I think also in this regard, it's maybe worth thinking about what was said in the first session yesterday. Like, targeting this is like wrestling an octopus. So you can tie down 2 arms, and you're still going to be slapped by 6 arms. And so definition is definitely a large matter, but they're also going to find other ways to sort of sneak around the whole thing, I guess. Not on a very positive note there, but I'll pass it over to you.
I mean, I can't comment on the G7. I think it's really useful to have externalities as part of an analysis, but maybe not as subsidies. Like, I think they should be separate, because also governments can just hide within that giant number and be like, oh, it's just those coal plants, got nothing to do with us. Whereas if you separate it out, you can target it and you say, no, that was you transferring money. Of course, you should also be saying those coal-fired power plants cost us hundreds of billions of dollars and trillions of dollars, or coal and oil and gas as well, make people sick, you know. Those are really important too. But for me, it's just, they're 2 different things.
And 2 different policy communities.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think we have time for another round of questions. Should we try to collect?
Yeah, he wants to challenge it.
Yeah. But you can go first then. But although Harrow had his hand up, do you also want to challenge that, or is it something related? Yeah.
It's not a question, it's just a statement to generate a debate. But I agree with you from a technical point of view, of course. But in many developing countries, less so in the EU countries, but in many developing countries, the cost of renewables is still significantly above the cost of fossil fuel production, as long as you do not count the value of lives. But if you count the value of lives, then the cost of renewables is significantly below. So there is huge political salience associated with incorporating the externalities.
Yes, we should,
and
but we
getting
just
support
shouldn't
for it.
call it this is the
So
value
I
of the
worry about dismissing the IMF definition, because actually the incorporation of externalities, particularly the air pollution externalities, is really important as part of the
Go on,
debate.
Ron.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, just one brief thing. I mean, everybody wants to do this for fossil fuels, and they're not doing it for anything else. It becomes very, very confusing, and particularly if you're looking at, for example, having some kind of international disciplines, and I've raised this question in discussions at WTO, and say, are you prepared to also count the externalities associated with agricultural production? Ooh, no. So I don't. It's a perfectly good term, externalities. I don't see why we don't use it more.
Just quickly.
Quickly, yeah. Because I know this conversation can go on
It's
for a
cool
long
vibe.
time.
I know, but it's a really exciting one. No, but we
is.
should definitely make those calculations about the days of the work days lost, about the cost to healthcare system, about the number of lives. But we just shouldn't list them as subsidies. We should list them alongside subsidies as the additional costs from burning fossil fuels.
I think there's a lot of raised hands. I think you take it, and we can continue this discussion because no, this is something people can debate for a long time, and it's very interesting. But maybe people can do that over lunch, and we should collect a few more questions.
Hi, I'm Sheila Whitley with the Overseas Development Institute. And mine is, I have two things. One, neither of them are that much questions for the panel, but just two quick things to say. I think just on this question of legal options and on the work that Ipek talked through on Europe production subsidies, there actually is a process now in Europe of incorporating both reporting on and addressing fossil fuel subsidies through the governance of the energy union. This is kind of at the beginning of the process. This involves potential, and some people may know even more about this in the room, but this includes reporting through European member states' national energy and climate plans. So there may be legal options there, and I think it's really important to keep an eye on this. Some of us at ODI are doing this, Climate Action Network Europe, and so we'd be happy to kind of talk more, because I really think Europe, with this now become more material 2020 deadline, are ahead of the G7, which is a 2025 deadline. A number of them are the same countries. So there's a lot to look at here, and I just want to make sure that that's kind of raised in the room, because I think there's a lot of people that we could work on more on this. And then just to say that we are starting, and there's a conference on carbon pricing leadership in Delhi in February, and we're preparing a paper on the links between carbon pricing and fossil fuel subsidies. So if anyone wants to talk about that at any time, we'd be really happy to. Realize it's maybe not a question, but if people want to react a little bit to either of those things.
Great. I think Harro has had his hand up for a long time.
Thanks, Jakob, and thanks for an excellent panel as well. Two questions, one specifically for Ron and one for the whole panel. Ron, the question for you is about the indicators process for the SDGs, and specifically 12.C. And I'm just wondering, given that there's been a lot of discussion about the problem of transparency or lack of transparency for production subsidies, so basically what are your hopes for that process in enhancing transparency of production subsidies? And then a question for the whole panel. We actually talked very little about reform. We talked a lot about problems and difficulties in estimating the scale. And we know that there are some examples of production subsidy reform. My question is for whomever wants to answer it. Are there any specific design lessons that we can think of for how to do production subsidy reform that might be different from consumption subsidy reform, where we actually have a large body of knowledge on how to do that?
I think we have time for one final brief question.
Sorry, my question almost accidentally carries on from Harry's question. Is there like a grade A example of both royalty and production subsidy reform that has gone together anywhere, where people have looked at both sides of that equation, where you look at the royalties, you look at the production subsidies, and and they were minimized to the point that they could be regarded as relatively optimal?
Thank you. So who wants to go first? Now it's open season.
Just very briefly on the SDG 12C1 actually indicator. So it's related to fossil fuel subsidies, and I think as a percentage of national expenditure on fossil fuels that's still being worked out. We actually contributed, we in the GSI contributed to a study which will be coming out this autumn for UN Environment, who are the custodians, using some of these technical jargons here for the process of that indicator. It's now been moved from a tier 3 to a tier 2. Once it's tier 1, then it's basically settled. But I mean, like all of the SDG indicators, it's a voluntary. So the reporting is voluntary. What we're hoping is this will prompt more cooperation among the intergovernmental organizations, reduce overlap. There's some overlap in what the organizations are doing in terms of collecting the data. So what UNEP's idea is, UN Environment's idea is to draw on this for the first estimates, but then to work with countries and try to encourage them to provide data that are missing. Whether it'll yield more results than, for example, the WTO obligation on reporting all subsidies to all industries remains to be seen. But I guess at the moment I have to be a bit optimistic.
Right, reform. Well, I guess that's not something that we can quickly discuss here, but we can definitely draw on many of the discussions from throughout the weekend, throughout the couple of days, and also earlier today, that it has to be part of the government's general trajectory in terms of their energy policy, and it will require decisions being made at high levels, such as phasing out coal, and then working through what kind of government support is needed, and such as the support we see in the coal sector, for example, directing that towards transition, rehabilitation, and still recognizing that once you see support to a sector in terms of producing, you still have to continue supporting them to support the transition. So it's not an easy question to answer, but we have to do it looking at the bigger picture, I think.
Yeah, so I'll come in from the Norwegian perspective again. And for Norwegian authorities, it has been really instrumental to assure the industry that they have long-term framework conditions. So it's like that's a very coined term in the Norwegian debate, and that's something that is very crucial for the government to convince them that nothing is going to change substantially anytime soon. This one exploration reimbursement scheme that we complain about, if it's deemed illegal, then it has to be scrapped. But some commentators say that it's probably possible to redesign it in some way, so it can still be continued, even if not with the exact same design. So that's the outlook to reform in Norway as it stands now.
You have a brief comment?
Just one comment on when you mentioned the exploration scheme. That is one area where we do think that subsidies just need to cease completely. Again, based on some of the discussions yesterday, we have to completely stop any exploration subsidies given carbon budgets and all the information that was shared yesterday.
Great. Jesse, for a final comment.
Oh my gosh. I can't comment on reform because oh God, we're in South Africa. It's like they're about to build new coal. It's a nightmare. Actually, my final comment is to say thank you to a lot of people in this room who've done all of the legwork to kind of get subsidies on the agenda, even in South Africa. It's thanks to you that it's even something that people are starting to talk about in the country, including in the Treasury, which is really, really great. So I think we'll get there. Just got to keep going.
Great. It's 12:15 now, so we are on time, and I would like to echo Jess and say thank you to the audience for showing up, but even more thank you to the panelists for